The Duchess's glass slipped from her hand and shattered across the marble floor. Every head in the ballroom turned. Lady Caroline Sheridan stood at the center of the glittering chamber beneath a storm of chandeliers while whispers moved through the crowd like wind through silk. "The Duke has taken them," someone murmured. "The law permits it." My God, and her own sons. Caroline did not bend to retrieve the broken glass. She did not move at all, because in that moment she understood something with terrifying clarity. Her children were gone, and every law in England belonged to the man who had stolen them. Across the ballroom, the High Duke of Ashbourne watched her. He had the kind of reputation that made noblemen lower their voices and servants step aside before he spoke. Tall, immovable, dressed in severe black that seemed carved from shadow rather than cloth, a man admired for his intellect, a man feared for his pride, and the man who, through a cold, calculated arrangement years ago, had tied Caroline's fate to a husband the law now allowed to destroy her. Caroline felt every eye upon her. The scandal had already begun. Lady Norton has lost her children. Her husband claims she disgraced him. They say the Duke himself once favored her. Whispers moved like knives. Caroline lifted her chin. She had been admired once. Admired for beauty, for wit, for the brilliance that made London's grandest drawing rooms lean closer when she spoke. Tonight none of that mattered, because in the eyes of English law, she was nothing. Years earlier, she had entered society like a spark dropped into dry tinder. Caroline Sheridan was born to brilliance. Her grandfather had been the celebrated playwright, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, a man whose wit once ruled Parliament itself. London still spoke his lines as though they were scripture. But wit did not pay debts. When Caroline's father died far from England, the family was left with a famous name and very little money. The Sheridan daughters were raised in a strange and fragile world, invited to grand houses, wearing gowns quietly altered again and again so no one would notice they were the same dresses. Beautiful, respected, but dangerously poor. Of the three sisters, Caroline was the one society could never quite control. Helen was graceful. Georgiana was gentle. Caroline was brilliant. Dark-haired, sharp-eyed, with a voice that could silence a room full of politicians if she chose to use it. She read poetry like a weapon. She argued politics at dinner tables where young ladies were meant to remain silent. Men admired her. Many feared her. And when she laughed, quick, intelligent, dangerous laughter, the entire room leaned toward her like flowers toward the sun. But brilliance was not a currency a young woman could live on. In Regency England, there was only one acceptable solution for a woman of good birth and little fortune: marriage. Caroline was 19 when George Norton had appeared. He was charming. That was the first deception. Handsome in a solid, respectable way, the younger brother of a baron, a barrister with political ambitions and just enough position to appear safe. More importantly, he listened. When Caroline spoke, George Norton looked at her as though he had discovered something rare. He praised her wit. He laughed at her clever remarks instead of shrinking from them. "You are wasted on this society," he once told her during a candlelit supper. "They admire your beauty and miss the mind behind it." No man had ever said that to her before. Caroline believed him. She was young, lonely, and tired of living in a household where every coin had to be counted before it was spent. When George proposed, the match seemed respectable. Promising, her mother encouraged it. Society approved. And so on a summer morning in the 827, Caroline Sheridan walked down the aisle of a London church in a white silk gown. The bells rang. Guests applauded. Her sisters embraced her. Yet as the vows were spoken, Caroline felt tears sliding down her cheeks for reasons she could not explain. Something inside her already knew. But by the time the carriage door closed behind the newlyweds, the law had already done its work. Under English law, a married woman ceased to exist. Her property became her husband's. Her earnings became his, and her children, every child she would ever bear, belonged to him completely. Caroline would discover the truth of that law faster than she could ever have imagined, because the charming man she had married vanished the moment the wedding ended. The rage began within weeks. The first time he struck her, it was because another gentleman complimented her poetry. The second time because she laughed too brightly at a dinner. George Norton did not love her brilliance. He resented it, and resentment in a man like George had a violent language. Inkstands thrown across rooms, hands gripping her wrists hard enough to bruise, a shove that sent her crashing against a door while servants pretended not to hear. Still Caroline endured, because by the time she realized the truth, she was already trapped. 3 sons were born in quick succession: Fletcher, Brinsley, and little William, They became the light inside a house that often felt filled with shadows. For them, Caroline wrote poetry late into the night to earn money that legally belonged to her husband. For them, she smiled through dinners and gatherings where London admired her wit without ever seeing the bruises hidden beneath silk sleeves. For them, she endured, until the morning in March 1836 when she returned home from a brief visit and discovered the nursery empty. 3 beds made, 3 coats missing, 3 children gone. Her husband had taken them, and the law said he had every right. Across the ballroom years later, the Duke of Ashbourne stepped forward at last. The murmuring crowd parted instinctively. He stopped beside Caroline. His voice was quiet, but every person in the room heard it. Your sons were removed this morning. Caroline turned toward him slowly. Her voice was calm enough to freeze the air between them. And the law? The Duke's jaw tightened. The law, he said quietly, is on your husband's side. Caroline felt something inside her break. Not softly, not quietly, but with the sharp, clean sound of something turning into a weapon. If the law belonged to men, then she would change the law itself, and every man who had ever helped build it would feel the force of her fury. But she did not yet know the price that vow would demand, because the war she was about to begin would cost her far more than reputation. It would cost her everything. The carriage stopped before the iron gates. Caroline stepped down before the driver could offer assistance. Beyond the tall hedges stood the house where her sons were being kept. One of the many quiet country estates owned by relatives loyal to her husband. The windows were shuttered. The garden was silent. It looked peaceful. That was the cruelest part. Caroline walked forward with the steady composure expected of a lady of her rank, though every step felt as if she were crossing a battlefield. A servant opened the door only halfway. "My lady, I have come to see my children." The servant's eyes shifted nervously toward the corridor behind him. "I am afraid that will not be possible." The words struck like ice. Caroline lifted her chin. "You may inform Mr. Norton that I am here. He has already given instructions." The servant hesitated before finishing. "You are not to be admitted." The door began to close. Caroline's hand caught the edge before it could shut. Her voice remained perfectly calm. "Fletcher is 7, she said quietly. "Brinsley is 5. And William is 3 years old." Her fingers tightened slightly against the wood. "You are telling their mother she may not see them." The servant swallowed hard. "My lady, the law—" "Yes." Caroline released the door. "I am aware of the law." The door shut in her face. She went to a solicitor the next morning. A serious gray-haired man listened carefully as Caroline described what had happened. He nodded slowly. Then he folded his hands. "Your husband has acted within his rights." Caroline's voice was dangerously quiet. "He has abducted my children." "He has taken his children, Lady Norton." The distinction landed like a slap. The solicitor continued gently. "Under English common law, a father possesses absolute custody of his children." "Absolute?" Caroline repeated. "Yes." "And the mother?" The man looked almost apologetic. "The law recognizes no separate legal standing for a wife." Caroline stared at him. "You mean I cannot even ask where they are?" "You may ask." "And if he refuses to answer?" The solicitor hesitated. "There is nothing the courts can do." Caroline rose slowly from her chair. For the first time that morning, anger burned through the numbness inside her. "So my husband may beat me," she said. "He may steal my children. He may take the money I earn. And the law calls this justice?" The solicitor did not meet her eyes. "It calls it marriage." Word spread quickly through London society. Scandal always moved faster than truth. At dinner tables and drawing rooms the whispers began. "They say Lady Norton drove him to it. Such clever women often make poor wives. I hear the Prime Minister himself used to visit her house rather frequently." The last rumor spread fastest of all, because it contained a name powerful enough to turn gossip into political danger. Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister of England. For years he had visited Caroline's drawing room, drawn by her brilliance and fearless wit. Their friendship had been open, intellectual, harmless, but London thrived on suspicion, and George Norton had begun to understand something very useful. If society could be persuaded that Caroline had betrayed her husband, then no one would care what had been done to her. One afternoon, Caroline received a letter sealed with her husband's crest. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The message inside was short, cold, formal. "You will cease attempting contact with the boys. They will remain under my authority. Further interference will have consequences." Caroline read the letter twice. Then she set it carefully on the desk beside her. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock. Slowly, deliberately, she moved toward the window. London stretched beyond the glass, carriages rattling along cobbled streets, elegant ladies strolling beneath parasols, gentlemen debating politics in clubs where laws were written by men who had never once asked a woman what justice looked like. Caroline pressed one hand against the cool glass. Somewhere in England her sons were being taught that she had abandoned them, that she did not care, that their father was protecting them from her. The thought hollowed her chest, but grief did not break Caroline Sheridan Norton. It sharpened her, because for the first time she understood the real enemy. Not merely George, but the system that had given him the power to destroy her life with a single decision. A system designed by men, for men. Behind her the door opened quietly. Her sister entered. "You cannot fight this, Caroline," she said softly. "The law is clear." Caroline turned slowly. Her dark eyes were blazing now. "Yes," she said. "The law is clear." She walked back to the writing desk and picked up her pen. Ink touched paper. The first words came easily. If the law could erase a woman, then she would make the entire country see it. And once they saw it, they would never be able to ignore it again. The Duke of Ashbourne did not visit women alone. London knew this. A man of his rank guarded his reputation with the same cold discipline he applied to everything else in life. Yet 3 evenings after Caroline's children vanished, his carriage stopped before her townhouse in Mayfair. Inside, the drawing room was dimly lit by candlelight. Caroline sat at her desk, still in the same dark gown she had worn all day, surrounded by sheets of paper covered in furious handwriting. Pamphlets, arguments, notes, not poetry this time. "War?" the servant announced him quietly. "His Grace the Duke of Ashbourne." Caroline did not rise. The Duke stepped inside with the measured composure that made even powerful men uneasy. Tall, broad-shouldered, impossibly calm. The sort of man who spoke rarely, and when he did, the room listened. He closed the door behind him. "You are writing to Parliament." It was not a question. Caroline's pen paused. "Yes." The Duke studied the papers scattered across the desk. Legal references, custody statutes, case precedents. "You intend to challenge English law," he said. Caroline finally looked up. "And you intend to stop me?" A faint muscle moved along the Duke's jaw. "I intend to warn you." She leaned back in her chair. "Then by all means, Your Grace." He walked slowly toward the fireplace. "Your husband is already speaking to certain political allies," he said. "Men who would prefer you remain silent." Caroline laughed softly. "Men always prefer that." The Duke did not smile. "They are preparing something else." Her eyes narrowed. "What?" He turned toward her. "An accusation." Caroline felt the air in the room change. "Of what kind?" The Duke held her gaze. "Adultery." The word fell between them like a blade. "With whom?" she asked quietly. He did not answer. He did not need to. Caroline's lips curved in bitter understanding. "Lord Melbourne." The Duke inclined his head once. "Yes." For a moment the only sound in the room was the fire snapping in the hearth. Then Caroline spoke. "My husband welcomed Lord Melbourne into this house. That does not matter. He profited from that friendship." "That will not matter either." She stood slowly. "And what exactly will matter?" The Duke's voice was calm. "What a jury of men chooses to believe." Caroline felt a flash of anger. "They will not believe such nonsense." The Duke's expression hardened. "London already does." Silence stretched between them. At last Caroline walked toward the window. Outside, carriages rolled past under the soft glow of gas lamps. The city looked beautiful, civilized, respectable. But she understood now how fragile that illusion truly was. "If he convinces them," she said quietly, "what happens?" The Duke answered without hesitation. "You will be ruined. Her reputation destroyed. Her friendships vanished. Her name spoken only in whispers. And worst of all, no one would ever question George Norton again." Caroline turned back toward him. "Why are you telling me this?" The Duke met her eyes steadily. "Because no one else will." She studied him. For years society had treated the Duke of Ashbourne like something carved from marble. Brilliant, distant, untouchable. Yet tonight something else flickered beneath the surface. Concern, or perhaps guilt. "You could stop him," Caroline said softly. "You have influence." The Duke's expression did not change. "Not enough. Or not enough desire." His gaze sharpened. "You think I approve of what is happening to you?" "I think," Caroline replied quietly, "that men rarely oppose injustice when it benefits them." For a moment something dangerous flashed in his eyes. Then it was gone. "You misunderstand me," he said. "Do I?" The Duke stepped closer. "You are about to make enemies in Parliament, Lady Norton." I already have. You will be mocked. I am accustomed to it. You may lose everything. Caroline's voice was steady. I already have. The Duke fell silent. The firelight cast sharp shadows across his face. Finally, he spoke again. Why fight? Caroline walked back to the desk. She lifted one sheet of paper. On it were the first lines of the argument she had begun writing. A simple statement. Clear, unforgiving. A married woman has no legal existence. She placed the page in front of him. Because that sentence, she said quietly, is a lie. The Duke studied the words. Then he looked up at her. You believe you can change centuries of law. Caroline met his gaze without hesitation. No. The faintest hint of admiration flickered in his expression. Then what do you believe? Her voice was calm. I believe I can shame them. For the first time that evening, the Duke of Ashbourne smiled, not warmly, not kindly, but with the dangerous respect of a man who had just recognized an equal. Then God help them all, he said quietly, because somewhere across England, George Norton was already preparing the next move, and the scandal he was about to unleash would drag Caroline's name through every court and drawing room in the country. The war had begun. The courtroom was already overflowing when the Duke of Ashbourne entered. London had come to watch the spectacle. Ladies pressed handkerchiefs to their lips behind silk fans. Gentlemen crowded the gallery, eager for scandal disguised as justice. Because today a woman's reputation would be dissected in public. And that woman was Caroline Norton. She was not permitted to attend. Under English law, a wife had no standing in a case of adultery between her husband and another man. She was not a person before the court. She was property being disputed. The murmurs swelled as Lord Melbourne, Prime Minister of Great Britain, took his seat. A powerful man, a careful man, and today the man accused of seducing another man's wife. The Duke of Ashbourne stood near the back of the room, arms folded behind him, watching the performance unfold with cold attention. He understood the truth long before the jury did. This trial was never about adultery. It was about destroying Caroline. Miles away in her quiet house, Caroline sat at her desk. The curtains were drawn. No visitors were permitted. She had refused them all. Society might feast on her humiliation, but she would not give them the spectacle of watching her break. Instead, she wrote, page after page, arguments, observations, proof. The law had stolen her children. Now it intended to steal her name. Her pen moved faster. Fury sharpened every word. Back in the courtroom, George Norton's counsel called witnesses, servants, former employees, a dismissed maid who claimed she had once seen Lord Melbourne sitting too close to Caroline on a sofa, a coachman who insisted the Prime Minister's carriage visited too often. Every whisper of gossip was paraded as evidence. The crowd leaned forward eagerly. The Duke watched the proceedings with growing contempt, because even the accusations lacked conviction. Dates were forgotten, stories changed under questioning, rooms were described that did not exist. When the Prime Minister's attorney rose to cross-examine, the entire performance began to collapse. One witness admitted she had been dismissed from Caroline's household for theft. Another could not remember the year of the alleged scandal. A third contradicted himself so completely that laughter rippled through the gallery. The Duke said nothing, but he knew the verdict already. By afternoon the jury returned. They had not even left the box to deliberate. The foreman stood. Not guilty. The room erupted. Relief. Laughter. Scattered applause. Lord Melbourne was cleared. The government survived. The scandal collapsed. Yet the Duke of Ashbourne remained perfectly still, because he understood the cruel truth hidden beneath that verdict. Caroline Norton had been declared innocent, and the law would still destroy her. That evening, Caroline finally received the news. The solicitor delivered it with careful optimism. The jury dismissed the accusations entirely. She set down the letter she had been writing. So my name is cleared. Yes. And my children? The solicitor hesitated. The silence answered her question. Caroline's fingers tightened slightly against the desk. May I now divorce my husband? I'm afraid not. Why? The man shifted uneasily. Divorce requires proof of adultery. Caroline stared at him. But the court declared me innocent. Exactly. The cruel irony settled over the room. Her vindication had become her prison. No adultery meant no divorce. No divorce meant she remained legally bound to George Norton. Her earnings still belonged to him. Her children still belonged to him. The solicitor cleared his throat gently. I am sorry, Lady Norton. Caroline dismissed him quietly. When the door closed, she remained seated for a long time. The fire in the hearth crackled softly. Somewhere in the city, bells rang for evening prayers. Finally, she stood and walked to the window. London glittered beyond the glass. Beautiful. indifferent, a city that had just watched her reputation placed on trial for entertainment. She thought of Fletcher, of Brinsley, of little William. 3 boys growing up somewhere without their mother, being told she had abandoned them. Her hand pressed slowly against the window pane. Then she turned back toward the desk. If the law had cleared her name yet still kept her chained, then the law itself was the enemy. Caroline picked up her pen again. The war she had begun was no longer only about her children. It was about every woman in England who could be erased by a wedding ring, and this time, she intended to win. Rain fell steadily over London the night the Duke returned. Caroline heard the carriage before the servant announced him. The sound of hooves against wet cobblestones, the heavy knock at the door. The Duke of Ashbourne did not call twice. When he entered the drawing room, water clung to the dark wool of his coat. Candlelight flickered across his severe features. He studied her quietly. "You look thinner." Caroline did not bother pretending warmth. Scandal is rarely nourishing. A faint shadow of approval passed across his expression at the remark. "You have become the most discussed woman in England." "I always was," she said calmly. "Now they simply pretend it is moral concern." The Duke removed his gloves slowly. "The verdict has protected the government." "Of course it has. But it has not protected you." Caroline laughed once. Soft. Bitter. "No, it has not." He moved closer to the fireplace, warming his hands. "You understand what happens now. My husband continues to own everything I earn." "Yes." "My children remain hidden from me." "Yes." "And society will continue whispering that I deserved it." The Duke's voice lowered. "Yes." Silence filled the room. Caroline walked toward the writing desk where letters lay stacked in neat rows. "You once asked me why I fight," she said. The Duke watched her carefully. "Yes." She lifted one of the envelopes. "My sons believe I abandoned them." Her voice did not tremble. "Every week I write to them." She placed the letter back among the others. "Every week the letters are returned unopened." The Duke's jaw tightened slightly. "George intercepts them." "Of course he does." Caroline turned toward him. "You know what that means, don't you?" He said nothing. "It means Fletcher will grow into a man believing his mother did not love him." Her voice softened. "It means Brinsley will forget the sound of my voice. And William," she paused briefly, "and William may never remember me at all." The fire cracked behind them. The Duke spoke carefully. "You cannot destroy yourself fighting this war." Caroline met his eyes. "Destroy myself?" "Yes. You are confronting Parliament, the courts, your husband, half the aristocracy. And you believe that frightens me?" The Duke did not answer. She stepped closer. "You know what frightens me, Your Grace?" His voice dropped. "What?" "That my sons will grow into strangers." For the first time since entering the room, something moved across the Duke's expression. Not pity, something heavier. "Regret. You are not alone in this," he said quietly. Caroline tilted her head slightly. "No?" The Duke hesitated. For a man known for absolute certainty, the pause was striking. "You have allies. In Parliament? Some. And you?" The question hung between them. The Duke's gaze held hers. "I have influence." "Then use it." "You misunderstand my position." "No," Caroline said softly. "I understand it perfectly." She turned away. "You fear the cost." The Duke's voice hardened slightly. "I fear failure." Caroline faced him again. "Failure?" "Yes. If we attempt reform and lose, the law may never change again." The words lingered in the room. For a moment Caroline said nothing. Then she returned to the desk and picked up the latest page she had written, a pamphlet, a legal argument. The first line stared back at them both. "A married woman has no legal existence." She handed it to him. "This is not merely my fight." The Duke read the sentence slowly. "What do you intend to do?" Caroline's voice was steady. "I will show England exactly what its laws truly are." "And if they refuse to listen?" Her eyes burned with quiet determination. "Then I will make it impossible for them to ignore me." The Duke folded the paper carefully. When he looked at her again, something had changed. Not hesitation, decision. "Very well." Caroline raised an eyebrow slightly. "You intend to help me?" His voice was calm. "I intend to ensure Parliament hears you." She studied him for a long moment. "Why?" The Duke did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "Because what has been done to you—" He stopped, then finished the sentence with quiet steel. "Should never have been possible." Caroline held his gaze. For the first time since this war had begun, someone powerful had chosen a side. But neither of them yet understood the terrible cost the battle ahead would demand, because the law Caroline intended to change had protected men like George Norton for centuries, and men who possessed centuries of power rarely surrendered it quietly. The House of Commons smelled faintly of ink, damp wool, and impatience. Members filled the benches beneath the high gallery while clerks moved quietly between desks carrying stacks of documents. Outside, rain swept across Westminster. Inside, a war older than any man in the chamber was about to begin. At the center of it stood a simple proposal. A mother, under certain circumstances, might be allowed to see her children, nothing more, nothing less. And yet the room hummed with unease, because the proposal had a name attached to it. Caroline Norton. The Duke of Ashbourne watched from the gallery above. His presence did not go unnoticed. A man of his rank rarely attended debates unless the matter held personal interest. Today it did. On the floor below, Mr. Thomas Talfourd, barrister and Member of Parliament, rose to speak. His voice carried clearly through the chamber. Gentlemen, the law of England grants absolute authority over children to the father. Several members nodded. This authority, Talfourd continued, exists even when that father proves cruel, negligent, or unfit. A murmur passed through the benches. He lifted a printed pamphlet. Many of you have read the arguments written by Mrs. Caroline Norton. More murmurs, some sympathetic, some irritated. Talfourd did not soften his tone. She has demonstrated with devastating clarity that a mother possesses no legal claim to the children she has carried, birthed, and raised. The room shifted, because every man present understood the implication. Power would have to be shared, and power once surrendered rarely returned. One aristocrat rose from the far bench. Are we now to overturn centuries of English law because one unhappy marriage ended poorly? Several men laughed. Another added sharply, next we shall allow wives to govern their husbands as well. More laughter. Above them in the gallery, the Duke's expression remained carved from stone, but his fingers tightened slightly against the railing. Across London, Caroline waited. She had not been invited to Parliament. Women were not permitted to participate in such matters. Instead, she sat in her drawing room surrounded by stacks of letters. Letters from mothers across England, women she had never met, women who had read her pamphlets and written to say the same thing. It happened to me too. One letter described a husband who drank away the family fortune and then removed the children to punish his wife. Another told of a violent man who had placed his daughter in the care of strangers rather than allow her mother to see her. Dozens of stories. Dozens of silent tragedies. Caroline read every one. Each letter added fuel to the fire already burning inside her. She was no longer fighting only for Fletcher and Brinsley. She was fighting for every mother England had erased. Back in Parliament, the debate had turned hostile. A bishop stood to oppose the bill. The authority of the father is ordained by Scripture, he declared solemnly. If we weaken that authority, we weaken the family itself. Another peer added coldly, maternal affection, though admirable, must not be permitted to undermine social order. The Duke's jaw hardened, because the men speaking those words had never held a child while it cried for its mother. Talfourd rose again. His voice was steady. Gentlemen, this bill does not grant equality. He paused. It merely recognizes that a mother is not nothing. The chamber fell briefly quiet, but resistance remained. Power was reluctant to loosen its grip. Late that evening, the Duke arrived at Caroline's house once more. She was still seated at the desk when he entered. The moment she saw his face, she understood. The debate did not go well. No. Caroline leaned back slowly. They will defeat it. Perhaps. She studied him carefully. You expected this? Yes. Then why bring the bill at all? The Duke stepped closer. Because sometimes a law must fail before the country realizes it is wrong. Caroline considered that. And if it fails? The Duke met her gaze. Then we fight again. Her lips curved faintly. You sound very certain for a man who once warned me not to begin this war. His voice softened slightly. I underestimated you. Caroline picked up her pen again. Many men have. The Duke watched as fresh ink touched the page. Another pamphlet, another argument, another weapon, and as the scratching of the pen filled the room, he realized something quietly astonishing. This woman, alone, disgraced, legally invisible, had already begun changing the foundations of England. Even if Parliament refused to admit it yet, the first victory arrived without triumph. There were no bells, no cheering crowds, no sudden restoration of everything Caroline had lost, only a sheet of paper, a new law, and the quiet, devastating knowledge that it had come too late. In 339, after months of debate, humiliation, ridicule, and relentless pressure, Parliament passed the Custody of Infants Act. For the first time in English history, a mother was recognized in law. Not fully, not equally, but undeniably. A woman of good character could now petition the court for custody of children under 7, and for access to older children. It was a fracture in the stone wall that had crushed women for centuries, and it existed because Caroline Norton had refused to disappear. When the news reached her, she stood very still by the window. The Duke of Ashbourne had brought the document himself. "It is done," he said quietly. Caroline took the paper in trembling hands. Her eyes moved over the lines she had dreamed of reading. For one suspended moment, hope rose inside her so sharply it almost hurt. Then she looked up. "Where are my sons?" The Duke did not answer at once. That silence told her everything. George had moved them to Scotland, beyond the reach of the new law. For a moment, Caroline could not breathe. All that work, all that fury, all that pain, and still her boys remained beyond her arms. She turned away from the window so he would not see the full force of her grief. But the Duke had already seen it. His voice was lower now. "Caroline!" It was the first time he had spoken her name. She closed her eyes. "When history remembers this," she said, "they will call it reform." She opened them again and looked straight at him. "But let them never forget what purchased it." The Duke's gaze held hers. He bowed his head once, not as a courtly gesture, but as an acknowledgement of suffering, of courage, of a war she had won and lost in the same breath. Caroline set the act carefully upon her desk. Then she reached for her pen. Because she understood at last what her life had become. She might not save her own children in time. She might never recover what had been stolen from her. But she would make certain no woman after her could be destroyed so easily. Outside, London glittered under the night sky, proud and indifferent as ever. Inside, a woman the law once claimed did not exist began rewriting England.